Where do we get to a point where a politician, the cult of personality becomes so strong that a politician feels free to say, I've done more for you than your own parents have? Like, that's madness.
Really?
And, I think I saw Jenna Goldberg say that if Barack Obama had said that, Fox News would be running with it 10 days straight. And they would. They would have. And there would have been a meltdown there. But again, Donald Trump says it, and it's ho-hum.
Yeah, Joe, there's a Trump discount, right? Because it's just dismissed as somebody who's doing shtick, right? He's up there doing the Friars Club material, take my wife, please. And I think because of that, he benefits. And by the way, that's been the story for 10 years. The coverage of his candidacy, the coverage of his presidency, judged much more as somebody who's doing entertainment than he is doing politics, because he has merged entertainment and politics, sort of a Barnum or a Buffalo Bill type figure who's now in elected office. And I think he's always benefited from that. So, Joe, I think what his supporters would say is, come on, man, he's just joking around. He's just doing material up there. But here's the thing with Trump. He always does the just kidding. Oh, I didn't really mean that. That's always his crutch. That's always his out. And so you have to take seriously even some of the stuff he says purportedly kidding, because you just don't know what he's going to do. And if he was kidding, then why is he putting his name on the $50? Why is he putting his name on everything that isn't nailed down? Because he obviously wants to have that kind of cult of personality hold on the country. I just don't think it's doing much. It's not helping his party. It's not cutting any ice for his party in the midterms. Standing up at one of the premier battleground states and saying, I have done more for you than your parents, is not reassuring to folks who are paying $4.05 a gallon for gas now. And I think that, that's the real issue for his party, Joe, is that he's just not giving them anything to run on. And that's part of the reason why they're just grabbing onto the DSA now, like people in a rushing river grabbing onto a twig over their heads, because there's nothing else. The only bill that they've passed this year of any consequence, the housing bill, he wouldn't even sign. So this is what's on offer. The other guys are going crazy, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the only thing the Republicans can do is point to the most extreme policies of a small faction of the Democratic Party. But as far as Donald Trump still denying affordability in a swing state like Michigan, again, grocery prices higher than they've been in 50 years. Gas prices high. Rent unaffordable. Forget mortgages. Student loans just collapsing. People can't put money away for their retirement. They can't even put money away for a home. And he's claiming that affordability is a hoax.
You can attribute all those higher prices to actions from this presidency, whether it be the big, ugly, or beautiful, whatever you want to call it, bill, or the chosen by him war in Iran. Prices are up due to the actions during this presidency.
Tariffs. The war. The
Doge cuts.
The Doge cuts. The slashing of health care by Republicans. Which, again, impacts red state Americans.
This is a Trump affordability problem.
Than blue state America.
So the other effort the Republicans can make is impact the vote. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow his executive order to take effect that restricts mail-in voting ahead of the midterms. The emergency appeal filed yesterday comes after a lower court's decision to uphold a ruling that blocks Trump's order, which seeks to create a federal list of eligible voters and direct the Postal Service to deliver ballots only to voters on that list.
It's just unbelievable. The millions and millions of voters he wants to disenfranchise.
The Trump administration asked the court to move quickly, arguing the new policies are critical and must be in place by the middle of August. Earlier this year, Democratic-led states sued to block the executive order, arguing the president lacks authority to impose election restrictions because elections are administered by the states, not the federal government. The Supreme Court requested states respond to Monday's emergency application by August 3rd, with a ruling expected shortly thereafter.
Jim VandeHei, a couple things happening here. First of all, you have to take the president literally here, and I know there are a lot of Democrats and a lot of lawyers that are going to be fighting hard. But you look at what's happening here. You look at him continuing to grouse and continue to kick around John Thune about the SAVE Act when the votes just aren't there. And yes, he wants to steal the election. He wants to rig the vote. Yes, he does. This is a guy that called the Georgia Secretary of State and said, find me 11,500 votes. You can do it. Just find those votes so I win this.
His recent address to the country was quite clear, too.
Win the state. That said, this has the feel of a guy who's trying to do what he did in 2020 when he kept talking about mail-in ballots and is being rigged. He's trying to set up an excuse for if Republicans lose.
No doubt. And you don't really have to even listen to us or trust us on this. Watch what Senate Republicans have been doing and saying. Anybody who understands election law at the state level understands that many parts of that act just aren't workable. They're not doable. They're not practical. And so, yes, most people think that you should have an ID, a valid ID, to vote. That's very different than what is included in that piece of legislation, which is why Republicans don't want anything to do with it. And they're ultimately not going to pass it. It's not going to be signed into law. And again, it is an obsession of Trump's. The fact that he took a primetime address and dedicated it to making a bunch of allegations, many of which are not true or certainly not validated by anyone, about the corruption in the election system that does not exist, shows that level of obsession. And it's so irritating to Republicans, none of whom have the cojones to go on and actually say it publicly, but it's so irritating to them because they're like, listen, let's go talk about affordability. Let's talk about the housing bill that we passed. Let's talk about the Trump accounts. Look at those Trump accounts, which actually seem like a pretty good idea to get people invested in the U.S. economy, teach them about capitalism, allow other people to get a tax-efficient way to help kids who might otherwise not be able to accrue the type of wealth that people coming from families of wealth can. Do a primetime address on that, but he doesn't. He's just so obsessed on this one topic. And taking it back to what you were talking about in terms of like him, saying I'm, doing more for you than your parents. Watch what the people are doing. People aren't buying it anymore. The polls have been very consistent. And by the way, they're consistent and getting a little bit worse each and every month in terms of inflation, in terms of the economy, in terms of the view of the war. So the big topics that he's touched, that he's championing, are not popular. They're not popular at all with independents. A lot of these, you're looking at 25% of independents support what he's doing in politics and in polling. That's atrocious. That's the type of stuff that costs you the House, costs you the Senate, and might not be able to overcome even the goofy stuff we were talking about from the DSA earlier. And yes, they'll cling to that, like Jonathan said, but is it enough to offset the fact that people don't like what they're seeing with their own two eyes?